The war was over. Hitler was dead. The Reich had fallen. But across America, behind quiet fences in towns like Aliceville, Alabama, and Salina, Kansas, something strange was happening. The prisoners of war, men who had once fought under the Nazi flag, were crying. Not because they were mistreated, not because they were homesick. They were crying because they didn't want to go home. A U.S. sergeant remembered it clearly. We told them the war was done, they'd be shipped back to Germany.
They'd be shipped back to Germany.
And these hardened soldiers, they broke down. One of them grabbed my sleeve and said,
"Please don't send us back there."
It sounded absurd. How could soldiers of Hitler's army, men who once invaded Europe, bombed cities, and swore they'd die for the fatherland, now beg to stay in the country they were supposed to hate? The truth is, these men had seen something in America they never saw under Nazism, and what they found behind those barbed wires changed them forever. It began in the spring of 1943. German prisoners, captured in North Africa after Rommel's defeat, were herded into ships bound westward. They didn't know where they were going. Some thought England. Others feared Siberia. Few imagined the unimaginable, that they were heading for the United States. When the first ships arrived in New York, the men were stunned. They'd been told American cities were crumbling under constant air raids, their people starving under chaos. But when they glimpsed Manhattan's skyline rising clean and untouched, their silence said everything. The prisoners were loaded onto trains under armed guard. The journey was long. Days of endless countryside rolling past, cornfields, rivers, small towns with children waving at the passing cars. America looked nothing like the monstrous land they'd been taught to fear. One prisoner, 22-year-old Friedrich Müller, later wrote, "We passed through miles of farms. Every house had a car. Every child had shoes. It was a land of plenty. In Germany, our families lived on potatoes and fear. Here, there was life everywhere. When the train finally stopped, the men stepped out into a different kind of silence. The air smelled of pine and wheat. A small sign nearby read, 'Camp Aliceville, Alabama.' Rows of wooden barracks stretched before them, surrounded by a simple wire fence. Guard towers stood in each corner, but something about it felt ordinary. Peaceful even. They expected brutality. Instead, they were given soap, clean uniforms, and a hot meal, with meat. As they ate, one soldier whispered, "This is a trick." Another replied quietly, "If it's a trick, I hope it never ends." None of them knew it yet, but for many, this camp, this so-called prison, would become the first place they'd ever truly feel free. The first weeks in the American camps were the strangest of all. The German prisoners waited for cruelty that never came. They expected starvation, beatings, or humiliation, the things their own army had done to captives in Europe. Instead, the guards smiled. They spoke politely. They even called the prisoners "Sir." Every day began with roll call, breakfast, and work assignments. But the food alone stunned them. Fresh eggs, bread, real coffee. Sometimes even butter, a luxury long gone in Germany. One prisoner joked, "If this is captivity, may the war never end." The U.S. Army had a reason for this treatment. America followed the Geneva Convention to the letter. The War Department wanted to prove, both to its allies and its enemies, that democratic nations didn't need to rule through fear. And so, the German POWs were treated as human beings, not monsters. They were given books, tools, and even musical instruments. Some camps had libraries stocked with German novels. Others had football fields, art classes, and workshops. At night, men who once manned machine guns sat sketching sunsets or learning English from dog-eared dictionaries. It wasn't just kindness, it was strategy. American intelligence officers realized that well-treated prisoners talked more. They wrote home with stories of how decently they were handled. Those letters, carefully censored but still heartfelt, worked like propaganda in reverse. They made the Nazi regime look small and cruel by comparison, but for the men inside the fences, the change was deeply personal. They began to see the difference between what they'd been told about the enemy and what they were living. Their guards weren't cruel. Their captors weren't beasts. In fact, many were young American boys not much different from themselves. One German sergeant, once a firm believer in Hitler, wrote in his diary, "I do not understand these Americans. They win the war and still feed us well. They let us write home. They give us soap. If Germany had won, would we have done the same? I fear not." Soon, small acts of humanity began to dissolve years of hate. Guards shared cigarettes. Prisoners taught the Americans German phrases. Some played music together on Sunday nights. The fences remained, but inside, something was shifting. Letters from the POWs began to include phrases that stunned their families back home. "We are treated better here than our soldiers are in Berlin. The Americans have food, light, and freedom. If you could see how they live, you would not believe the propaganda." For the first time, many of these men began to wonder if everything they'd been taught about Germany's superiority was a lie. They didn't realize it yet, but those fences were not trapping them. They were protecting them from the ruins of the world they had left behind. As months passed, the war that had once consumed the world grew distant beyond the barbed wire. Inside the camps, the Germans' lives found a strange rhythm. Predictable, even peaceful. They woke to the smell of bacon and coffee, lined up for roll call under the morning sun, and walked to their work sites. Many were assigned to nearby farms, factories, and sawmills under military supervision. They were still prisoners, but outside those fences, something profound began to happen. They started to feel useful again. On American farms, POWs picked cotton, harvested wheat, and mended fences. They replaced local workers who had gone to war. Some learned to drive tractors. Others herded cattle or repaired barns. And as they worked side by side with American farmers, suspicion began to fade. The farmers were the first to notice the difference. These weren't fanatical Nazis anymore, just tired men who wanted to work, eat, and live. One farmer in Texas recalled, "They were polite, hard-working. They didn't want trouble. We'd eat lunch together under the trees. Sometimes we forgot they were prisoners." Many locals began to treat the Germans less like enemies and more like guests. They shared meals, told jokes, exchanged stories about home. A strange friendship took root in the soil of small-town America. Some of the POWs even began attending local church services, sitting quietly in the back pews, heads bowed beside the same people who had sons fighting overseas. Pastors preached forgiveness, mercy, and understanding. And in those moments, men who once saluted Hitler found themselves singing hymns beside American farmers. There was laughter, too. Baseball games between the guards and prisoners became weekend traditions. The Germans learned to cheer, argue over strikes, and even mimic American slang. When one of them hit a home run, the crowd would roar, not for a German or an American, but simply for the man who'd won the game. And yet, the irony was not lost on them. The same country that had bombed their cities was now feeding them. The same soldiers who had captured them now shared meals and laughter. One young prisoner from Hamburg wrote home, "I do not know what to think anymore. The Americans work beside us, laugh with us, and treat us like friends. They do not hate us. They do not even fear us. It is confusing, but it feels right." Inside the camps, the men began to change. The swastika armbands were gone. The proud, rigid posture of the German soldier softened. They smiled more. They wrote home about kindness instead of victory. They spoke of peace, a word that had once sounded like defeat. By 1944, the war in Europe was burning itself out. The Allies were closing in on Berlin, and as rumors of Germany's collapse reached the camps, something unimaginable began to happen among the prisoners. They were afraid, not of the Americans, but of going home. When Germany finally fell in May 1945, the camp loudspeakers crackled with the news. Guards cheered. Some cried. But for the German prisoners, the announcement brought silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Freedom was supposed to be a dream. Instead, it felt like a sentence. Letters from home began to arrive weeks later. Torn envelopes, smudged ink. Some bore no return address at all. And inside, words that shattered the men's hearts. The house is gone. Your mother is missing. There is nothing left in Bremen. We are starving. Germany was rubble. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Cologne had become skeletons of stone. Roads were craters, factories twisted metal, families scattered like ashes. The war that they had once fought so proudly had burned everything they knew to the ground. In the camp canteens, men sat with letters trembling in their hands, staring at words they could hardly believe. Others didn't receive any letters at all. Those were the worst off, because silence meant everyone they loved was likely gone. And so the irony deepened. They were prisoners in America, but they were alive, fed, and safe. The men they'd once called enemies were now the only people keeping them from starvation. One prisoner said quietly to a guard in Arkansas, "You call this prison? My home is the prison now." Outside the wire, the American summer rolled on. Children played baseball. Farmers tended their crops. But inside, the Germans began to feel a strange guilt. Survivor's guilt mixed with a dawning realization. They had lost not just a war, but their place in the world. The camp chaplains, many of them American pastors, noticed the change. They saw men who no longer talked about Hitler or the Reich, but about rebuilding, forgiveness, and faith. Bible studies and English lessons filled the empty hours. Some men even began writing to their guards' families, exchanging recipes and stories. Slowly, the guards began to see it too. These weren't enemies anymore. They were just men who wanted to belong somewhere that wasn't burning. And that's when the whispers began. In hushed tones, around campfires and in bunks after lights out, the question spread from mouth to mouth. What if we didn't go back? It started as a joke, but as the weeks passed, it became a longing. They talked about staying, about finding jobs, farms, new lives, about starting over in the country that had shown them humanity when their own nation had lost it. But the Geneva Convention was clear. Every POW would be sent home once the war was over. Still, the thought refused to die. Some men began volunteering for extra duties. They cleaned kitchens, repaired fences, helped with construction, anything to stay busy, to seem indispensable, to delay the inevitable transport back to Europe. For the first time, German soldiers, once symbols of fear, were working harder to stay in an American prison than to escape it. The world outside the fences was rebuilding itself, but inside, something even stranger was happening. Enemies were turning into immigrants in spirit, dreaming not of returning home, but of staying right where they were. As summer turned to autumn in 1945, the camps across America began to hum with new orders. Trucks rolled in, guards checked lists, commanders posted bulletins. All German prisoners are to be processed for repatriation. The war was over. The paperwork had begun. Each man would be screened, documented, and shipped back across the Atlantic, through New York, Boston, or Norfolk, to what remained of the fatherland. But for many of the Germans, the idea of returning home now felt like a punishment worse than captivity. Rumors spread like wildfire. Towns flattened, families gone, Russian troops occupying the east, famine spreading through the west. Those who still had letters from home passed them quietly from bunk to bunk. One read aloud a few lines that silenced the entire room. The children dig for potato peels in the ruins. We sleep in what used to be a tram station. Come home if you can, but there is no home. For men like Carl Miller, who had worked on a Texas farm for 2 years, the thought of leaving was unbearable. The farmer's family had treated him kindly, gave him meals, laughed at his broken English, even let him help with Sunday chores. They didn't see him as a Nazi, just as a worker who did his job with care. When Carl got the notice that his transport date was approaching, he didn't celebrate. He sat on the porch steps of the farmhouse, staring out at the golden wheat fields that stretched endlessly into the horizon. It was a peace he hadn't known since before the war. The farmer's wife brought him coffee and said softly, "You're not like the ones they told us about." He looked up, unsure what to say. "Neither are you," he replied. In camp after camp, stories like this repeated. Prisoners were no longer just numbers on rosters. They were farmhands, helpers, even friends. Guards who once barked orders now shared cigarettes and talked about baseball. The line between captor and captive had blurred into something almost human. But Washington didn't deal in friendship. The army wanted the camps emptied. The public wanted their soldiers home. And Europe, scarred and starving, needed its young men back to rebuild. Bureaucracy didn't care if the men were happier here. The orders were clear. Every prisoner goes home. Some tried to stall. Others volunteered for work programs, hoping to extend their stay. A few even begged their American supervisors to forget to report them missing, but the paper machine kept grinding. Lists became manifests. Manifests became ships. And one by one, the men who had found a strange, fragile peace in America were herded toward trains bound for the coast. The journey home would not be a victory. It would be a return to a place that no longer existed. And as the fences disappeared behind them, many looked back one last time, not at the guard towers, but at the sunsets, the fields, the laughter that had somehow survived even in captivity. They weren't thinking of Germany. They were thinking of America, the only enemy who had treated them like men. The trains clattered east through the heart of America, across the plains, through the towns, past children waving from the tracksides. The prisoners stared from the barred windows, their eyes following the lines of telephone poles and open skies. Some smiled faintly. Others stayed silent, lost in thoughts too heavy to share. Each mile felt like a slow goodbye. At the ports, Norfolk, Boston, New York, they saw the ocean again. But this time, it didn't carry them toward conquest. It carried them toward ruins. The ships waiting in the harbors were crowded and gray, their decks filled with men in mismatched uniforms, the remnants of the once mighty Wehrmacht, now reduced to nameless passengers. No fanfare, no flags, just the steady wind off the Atlantic, sharp and cold. On board, the silence was suffocating. There were no songs, no speeches, only the endless rhythm of the waves and the creak of the ship's hull. Some men huddled in groups whispering about their homes, their families, what might still be standing. Others played cards, anything to distract from the gnawing dread that waited on the other side of the water. Carl Miller, the farmhand from Texas, kept a folded photograph in his pocket. It wasn't of Germany. It was of the farmer's family, smiling in front of their red barn. They'd given it to him the morning he left, with a single line written on the back. "If you ever find your way back, there'll be a place at the table." He read those words over and over, as if memorizing them might keep him anchored to the world he had just lost. When the ship finally neared Europe, the smell of smoke hung on the wind. Even from the water, the destruction was visible. Cities flattened, ports in ruins, the coastline a graveyard of ships and debris. And then came the reality. Disembarking in Bremerhaven, the men found not a homeland waiting, but a wasteland. Bombed-out buildings stretched as far as the eye could see. Roads were gone. Train stations were husks. Civilians shuffled past in rags, their faces hollow, their eyes wary. Mothers didn't recognize their sons. Wives didn't know if they were widows. The prisoners had returned free men, but there was nowhere to go. Some were sent to work clearing rubble, rebuilding bridges, helping the Allied occupation forces. Others simply wandered, searching for the addresses written on crumpled scraps of paper that led to nothing but dust. At night, the sounds of wind through broken windows filled the air. For many, America began to feel like a dream of warmth, of laughter, of order, of meals that came on time. One man wrote in his diary, "I am home, and yet I have never felt more foreign." The war had ended, but peace, true peace, had not yet begun. And as they rebuilt what was left of Germany, a quiet wish began to grow in their hearts. A wish that someday, somehow, They might return to the country that had once held them captive but treated them like men. The months that followed were gray. Germany in 1946 was not a land of victors or vanquished, just survivors. Cities were ash, families were fragments, and food was a privilege, not a certainty, yet, amid the hunger and the rubble, small envelopes began to arrive from across the sea. The first one came to Carl Miller one rainy afternoon. The return address made him freeze. Amarillo, Texas. He tore it open with trembling hands. Inside was a short note written in careful, looping handwriting. "We hope you're safe, Carl. The wheat came in early this year. We still tell everyone about the German who could outwork any Texan." It was signed by the farmer's wife, the same woman who had given him coffee on that porch. For the first time since he'd stepped off the ship, Carl smiled. He wrote back that night by candlelight. "The city is gone, but I am alive. Tell the children I miss their laughter." Weeks later, more letters began to circulate among former prisoners. Some came from Kansas, others from Georgia or Iowa. Guards, farmers, and even townsfolk who had once met the enemy soldiers now sent postcards, photographs, and Christmas greetings. One guard from a camp in Colorado wrote to his former prisoner, Otto, "Funny how you were my prisoner, yet you taught me patience. My wife still uses your bread recipe." The letters became a lifeline. Thin threads stretched across the Atlantic, connecting men who had once faced each other as foes. They wrote about everything: harvests, families, weather, rebuilding, and sometimes memories of laughter shared behind barbed wire. In those letters, guilt faded. Politics disappeared. Only humanity remained. By 1947, a few Americans began sending packages too: soap, sugar, flour, even used clothing. The soldiers who had fed their captives now fed their former enemies. The irony was not lost on anyone. Newspapers in both countries occasionally caught wind of these stories. "Ex-POW corresponds with U.S. farmer," one headline read. But most of these exchanges stayed quiet. Private acts of friendship in a world still divided by fear. For the Germans, the letters became symbols of something precious: dignity. After years of propaganda, of hatred, of marching and shouting, here was proof that kindness could cross oceans faster than any army. Carl kept his letters bundled in a tin box. On the lid, he scratched 3 words in English: "Better this way," and in countless ruined towns across Germany, other men did the same. They weren't writing to comrades or commanders anymore. They were writing to Americans. The people who had once guarded their fences and were now, somehow, guarding their hope. The war was supposed to end all connections between enemies. But for these men, it had created the first real connection they'd ever known. By 1948, Germany had changed, but not for the better. The cities still looked like ghosts. Walls held up by sheer willpower and scavenged bricks. Children scavenged coal dust from railway embankments. Hunger wasn't as sharp as before, but it lingered like a wound that never healed. And for the former POWs who had tasted the strange piece of life in America, a quiet decision was beginning to take shape. They wanted to go back. For many, it wasn't just nostalgia, it was survival. In America, they had worked on farms, eaten well, and lived without fear. Here, the only work left was clearing rubble or standing in endless ration lines. Carl Miller was one of them. He'd taken a job in Bremen unloading cargo from British supply ships. But every day, as he watched the crates labeled USAID being stacked on the docks, he couldn't help but think, "I used to be part of that world." He wrote to the farmer in Texas again. This time, the letter was longer, more direct. "My hands are the same. My work is the same. Only the land is different. If I could come back, I would work for you again, even without pay." Months later, a reply came, along with a photograph of the farm. The wheat field stretched wide, the sky blue and endless. At the bottom, in pencil, the farmer had written, "We'd have you back tomorrow, Carl, but they won't let us." He was right. Immigration laws after the war were tight. Germany was occupied, divided, and under watch. No German ex-soldier, no matter how harmless, could simply cross the ocean and start over. But that didn't stop them from dreaming. Across Germany, former POWs met in cafes and church basements, swapping stories, letters, rumors. Some said they knew a farmer in Iowa willing to sponsor a worker. Others claimed that the Red Cross could help file petitions. It was all uncertain, but the longing was real. They spoke of America like pilgrims spoke of paradise, not because it was perfect, but because it represented something they had lost: order, kindness, purpose. One night, Carl sat with a few other men from his old camp. Over cheap beer, they talked quietly about what it meant to belong somewhere. "Germany doesn't want us," one said bitterly. "We're not heroes. We're not victims. We're just ghosts," Carl nodded. "But in America, I was someone. I mattered." The room fell silent. Because that was the truth no one could quite say out loud. In captivity, they had been seen. In freedom, they were invisible, and so plans began to form. Not grand ones, just whispers of possibility. Maybe through a church. Maybe through a sponsor. Maybe someday the Atlantic would open again. They didn't know if it would ever happen. But they knew one thing for sure. America had become more than a place. It had become an idea. One worth chasing, even from the ashes. By 1949, the Atlantic had become more than a stretch of ocean. It was a wall made of politics, fear, and paperwork. But letters began to chip away at it. In small towns across America, Kansas, Georgia, Idaho, Texas, people were writing to Washington. Farmers, pastors, and even housewives were sending handwritten pleas to congressmen, to immigration offices, to the War Department. They weren't asking for money or favors. They were asking for men. Men with names like Carl Miller, Otto Brandt, Hans Richter. One Kansas farmer wrote, "During the war, this young man worked our fields as a prisoner. He treated our land like his own. We have room for him here. Isn't it time we show mercy as well as victory?" Another letter came from an Illinois pastor. "The German boys who worked at the camp have sent us Christmas cards for years. They ask not for aid, only for the chance to earn their bread again." At first, these letters went unanswered. But as the Cold War tightened and the U.S. began seeing West Germany as an ally, attitudes began to shift. Former enemies were becoming potential friends. The State Department started reviewing special cases, especially those where American citizens vouched for a returning POW-S character. And slowly, quietly, approvals began to appear. Carl Miller received his notice in early 1950. The letter was stamped "Approved" for agricultural visa. He read it 3 times before believing it was real. When he arrived back at the port, the same kind of ship that had once carried him home in shame now carried him toward hope. He could barely breathe. The Atlantic wind that once chilled him now felt like a welcome. On the other side, waiting on the dock in Texas, stood the farmer and his wife. They waved as if greeting family. Carl dropped his small suitcase and ran to them, the old fear gone, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. And he wasn't alone. Dozens of men like him were returning, quietly, unnoticed by history books. They slipped back into the fields and factories of America, no longer prisoners, no longer soldiers, just workers, neighbors, friends. For the first time, they weren't defined by the war they'd fought, but by the peace they helped rebuild. Carl's hands, once rough from labor under guard, now plowed his own rows. His English improved. He joined the local church. At night, he'd sit on the porch, listening to the crickets, and think of how far the world had come, and how easily it could have gone the other way. In the silence of those Texas nights, he realized something profound. Sometimes, the greatest victory doesn't come from conquering an enemy. It comes from forgiving one. The early 1950s brought a strange new chapter, one that no general, no treaty, no surrender document could have predicted. Across America, scattered through farms, factories, and quiet towns, lived hundreds of men who had once worn the uniform of the Wehrmacht. They had come as prisoners, stayed as workers, and now, slowly, they were becoming something else entirely. Americans. Carl Müller was one of them. He worked the same Texas fields that had once been his prison detail, but now they were his livelihood. The farmer, old now, called him Son. His wife baked him pies on Sundays. The children he once helped with their chores were grown. One off to college, another starting his own farm. To anyone passing by, Carl was just another hard-working immigrant with a thick accent and kind eyes. Few knew his past. Fewer cared. He'd earned his citizenship after 5 years of labor and good conduct, sponsored by the same family who had once watched over him behind barbed wire. When he took the oath, his voice cracked. Not from nerves, but from disbelief. "I swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America." It wasn't just a ceremony. It was redemption. But Carl wasn't alone. Across the country, similar stories unfolded. In Nebraska, a former Luftwaffe mechanic became a respected airplane engineer. In Minnesota, a one-time infantryman opened a bakery that the whole town loved. In Louisiana, a former U-boat radio operator married the daughter of the man who had once guarded his camp. Each story was a quiet miracle. Lives rebuilt not with grand speeches or parades, but with small acts of work, trust, and grace. What made it even more astonishing was the silence surrounding it. The newspapers rarely mentioned it. Hollywood never filmed it. To most Americans, the German POWs had vanished after the war, but in truth, they had simply blended into the fields, the towns, the heartbeat of the country that had once been their enemy. Carl would sometimes think of Germany, of the ruins, the ashes, the people he'd left behind. He sent letters home when he could, money when possible, but he never regretted staying. One summer night, sitting on the porch under a sky filled with stars, the farmer's wife asked softly, "Do you ever miss it?" Germany. Carl took a long breath, watching fireflies drift across the dark. "I miss the people I lost," he said, "but not the place I left." The silence that followed was peaceful. For men like Carl, America had not erased the past. It had given it meaning. Their lives had become living proof that mercy could achieve what war never could. And as he looked out over the fields he had once seen through barbed wire, Carl realized something few men ever do. Sometimes you don't escape a prison by breaking out. You escape it by being welcomed in. History books rarely mention them. In the grand story of World War II, with its invasions, bombings, and generals, there's little space for the quiet human stories that unfolded far from the front lines. Yet, across America, those stories lived in small towns, on farms, and in the memories of families who had once looked across a fence at their enemy and seen something unexpected: humanity. In the years after the war, the former POW camps fell silent. Barbed wire was taken down, barracks were torn apart, and the land was reclaimed by fields or factories. But the impact lingered in ways no one anticipated. Farmers remembered the German boys who worked tirelessly under the sun. Children who had once feared them now recalled the men who carved them wooden toys or taught them songs in another language. Even guards, hardened veterans of battle, spoke of how strange it felt to miss the men they had once been ordered to watch. Letters continued to cross the Atlantic for decades. Some were simple Christmas greetings. Others carried photographs of newborn children, weddings, or funerals. Each letter was a thread, fragile but unbroken, that connected two worlds once divided by war. In 1960, a reunion took place in Alabama. A group of local families invited several former POWs to visit, men who had, by then, settled in the U.S. or returned as visitors. When they arrived, gray-haired now, they embraced their old guards like brothers. Reporters who attended expected tension or awkwardness, but what they saw instead was laughter, tears, and long silences filled with mutual respect. One American veteran told a journalist, "We were both just following orders, but somewhere along the way, we stopped being enemies." The German who stood beside him nodded quietly and said, "In your country, I learned what freedom truly means. Not victory, but forgiveness. As the Cold War deepened and Germany became America's ally, those once forbidden friendships became symbols of reconciliation. Schools began to teach about the POW camps not as dark chapters, but as proof that decency could survive even in wartime. Some towns even built small memorials, simple plaques near where the camps once stood. They didn't glorify the soldiers or the war. They simply read, "Here, enemies met as men." Carl Miller lived long enough to see those memorials appear. He would sometimes visit one on his travels, standing quietly, hat in hand, as children ran past without realizing what the place once was. And maybe that was the point, that their story didn't need to be told loudly. It just needed to be remembered. Because in a world that had seen what hatred could do, these men had shown something else entirely. That kindness, given even to an enemy, can echo longer than any victory. It was 1972 when Carl Miller finally decided to go back. 27 years had passed since he'd last walked German soil, the same number of years he had lived in America. The letter that pushed him to make the journey came from Bremen, written in neat but shaky handwriting. "Carl, if you can come, please come. Your sister is ill. She asks about you often." He hadn't seen her since the war. She had been a teenager when the bombs fell. Now she was an old woman, frail and fading. Carl booked his passage quietly. He didn't tell many people. The farmer's wife cried when he said goodbye, pressing a rosary into his hand. "It kept me safe when my son went to Korea," she said. "Maybe it'll bring you back again." The flight to Germany felt longer than the entire war. When the plane descended over Bremen, the city looked nothing like the rubble he remembered. Streets were alive, lights glowed, and new towers reached upward. Rebuilt, modern, proud. Yet as he stepped onto the tarmac, the air carried the same chill he had known as a boy. He found his sister living in a small apartment by the river. Her eyes filled with tears the moment she saw him. "You came back," she whispered. They spent hours talking, about the years lost, the people gone, the country reborn. She told him about how she'd searched for him after the war, only to hear rumors that he'd died in America. He laughed softly. "No, I lived in America," he said. "It's not the same thing." As the days passed, Carl walked the streets of Bremen and barely recognized his homeland. Children played in places where once there had been ruins. Trains ran smoothly through stations rebuilt from ashes. Yet something inside him felt detached, like a visitor in a museum of his own life. He met other former soldiers, too. Some had stayed, some had returned after years abroad. Most carried the same strange emptiness. Proud of the new Germany, grateful for peace, but haunted by what had been. One evening, Carl stood outside a church that had survived the war with only half its roof. The bells rang as the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting the city in amber light. He thought of Texas, the endless fields, the laughter, the smell of soil after rain. And he realized with a quiet ache that while he had been born German, he had died American. Not in nationality, but in spirit. When he boarded the plane back to the U.S., his sister's last words stayed with him. "You found your peace somewhere else. Don't lose it again." Back in Texas, the farmer's wife was waiting at the airport, older now but still smiling. "You came home," she said. Carl nodded. "Yes," he said softly, looking out at the open land stretching to the horizon. Home. The years after Carl's return passed quietly, like the last pages of a book that no one wanted to end. He built a small life in Texas, steady and simple. He never married, though the farmer's family insisted he was part of the family anyway. When the old man passed, Carl helped run the farm with his sons, teaching them the things he'd learned both in war and in peace: discipline, humility, and the value of a day's labor done with care. He never spoke much about the war, not out of shame, but because he believed the world had already heard enough of death. When people asked, he'd just say, "It was a bad time, but I met good people." In the local town, everyone knew him simply as Mr. Carl. He fixed fences, helped at church fairs, and volunteered at the food pantry. No one cared that he had once worn a different uniform. To them, he was just another hard-working man who had helped build their community. Every few years, new people would move into town and someone would mention, almost casually, "You know, that man over there? He used to be a German soldier." And the newcomers would blink, stare, and then say the same thing everyone else did. You'd never know. As the decades turned, Carl watched his adopted country change. New highways, new wars, new faces. Sometimes he'd see news reports about Germany, about the Berlin Wall, about reunification. He'd sit by the radio, listening in silence, proud and sad at once. He wrote to his sister until she passed, then kept her last letter in his Bible. On the back, she'd written, "We were born in ruins, but you lived in light." In his final years, his health began to fade. The farmer's grandchildren, now adults, often visited, bringing him homemade bread or reading the letters he could no longer see clearly. One day, when asked if he regretted anything, he smiled faintly and said, "Only that I didn't plant more trees. They take so long to grow, but they're the only thing that outlives war." When he died in 1988, the town held a small service. The church pews were full. Farmers, veterans, families, children he'd once taught to read. The flag that draped his coffin wasn't German. It was American. And next to it, placed by the farmer's widow, was a single photograph. The one of him standing beside their barn, smiling, years ago. On the back she had written, "He came here as an enemy and left as one of us." After the service, the local paper ran a short obituary. Just a few lines. Carl Miller, farmer, neighbor, and friend. Once a prisoner, always a man of peace. His story faded quietly into history, but the people who knew him never forgot. Because in a world rebuilt from the ashes of hate, Carl had shown that reconciliation isn't written in treaties or borders. It is written in how we choose to treat one another when the guns fall silent. Carl S.'s story wasn't unique. It was one thread in a much larger tapestry woven quietly across America. From 1945 to the early 1950s, nearly 500,000 German POWs had passed through the United States. Most returned home, but a few, a small, almost invisible number, found their way back again. This time not as prisoners but as citizens, farmers, builders, husbands, and fathers. They didn't leave monuments or headlines behind. What they left was something far greater, proof that humanity could survive even the ugliest war in history. In small towns from Nebraska to Alabama, the memory of those German boys lingered long after the camps disappeared. Locals remembered them not as enemies, but as men who sang while they worked, who carved toys for children, who prayed beside Americans at Sunday services. When the Cold War came and fear swept through the world again, some of those families wrote to each other still. Letters between two nations that had once tried to destroy each other. They sent Christmas cards, baby announcements, wedding invitations. It was as if their friendship had become a quiet rebellion against the idea that enemies must always stay enemies. Historians would later call it the human side of victory. Decades later, as researchers began uncovering the forgotten POW stories, they found something unexpected. American families who still kept photographs, postcards, and wooden carvings made by German prisoners. Each one told the same story, that war had divided men who were never truly different to begin with. A historian once interviewed a farmer's son who had known Carl as a child. The man smiled, remembering. "He taught me how to drive a tractor before my own father did. I was scared of him at first. Then I found out he was scared of me too. That, when I realized, fear doesn't last long when you work beside someone every day." In Germany, too, the legacy lived on. Some of the returning POWs spoke of America not with bitterness, but with gratitude. They told their children that they had seen another way of life, one where freedom didn't come from power, but from decency. For many of them, it changed how they rebuilt their homeland. Some became teachers, pastors, and social workers. Others joined the new democratic government, determined that Germany would never again lose its soul to tyranny. And somewhere in Texas, in a field of wheat, The wind still whispers through rows planted long ago by a man who came as a prisoner and stayed as a friend. His name may have faded, but his story, and the stories of thousands like him, still linger, carried in the quiet spaces between generations. Because history remembers wars through generals and battles, but peace, true peace, is remembered through the people who refused to let hatred be the final word. It was 1962 when Carl returned to America. This time, not in uniform, not in chains, but as a free man with silver at his temples and a camera hanging from his neck. He had saved for years, determined to see the country that had changed him. The moment he stepped off the train in Kansas, it felt like stepping back into a memory. The air was warm. The wheat shimmered in the wind. The same scent of soil and diesel carried through the open fields. He drove out to the small town where he'd once been a prisoner. The old camp was gone, replaced by a warehouse and a stretch of farmland. But the people remained, and when he stopped at the diner on Main Street, the waitress recognized his accent instantly. "You're not from around here," she said, half smiling. "No," Carl replied softly. "But once I was. Word spread fast in a town that small." Within hours, people came. Gray-haired farmers, their wives, even children who had been babies when he'd last seen them. They brought coffee, pie, and stories. One man placed an old photograph on the table. A group of young men in ragged uniforms standing beside a tractor. In the center, Carl, smiling shyly. "You fixed our combine," the farmer said, his voice cracking. "My father never forgot." That night they gathered in the community hall. Someone brought a guitar. Someone else brought a bottle of bourbon. They sang old German folk songs, American hymns, and the kind of country tunes that had once echoed faintly across the barbed wire fences of the POW camp. Carl looked around the room and felt the years dissolve. The war, the hatred, the fear, all of it seemed like a bad dream. Here, he was not a German soldier. He was simply a man among friends. Before leaving, he visited the small cemetery on the edge of town. Beneath a tree stood a weathered wooden cross, one of the few markers from the camp's infirmary. He knelt, placed his hand on the earth, and whispered in German, "We made it. We lived. You would have liked this peace." When he returned to Germany, Carl told his children about that night. Not about the war, or the battles, or the hunger, but about the kindness of strangers, the way people had seen him not as an enemy, but as a human being. That story became his family's inheritance. His grandchildren, growing up in a peaceful Europe, would one day visit America too, not as soldiers, not as prisoners, but as tourists walking freely through a land their grandfather once thought he would never see again. And in that quiet, simple reunion between past and present, the final chapter of that strange wartime story found its peace. Most Americans today have no idea that their grandparents once lived beside enemy soldiers. From 1943 to 1946, over 425,000 German prisoners of war were held in more than 500 camps scattered across nearly every U.S. state, from California deserts to the pine forests of Maine. They arrived quietly, under tight guard, on trains that rolled through the night. Locals often didn't know who the new workers were until they saw them behind barbed wire the next morning. At first, fear spread fast. Rumors flew that Nazis had come to escape, that they'd burn farms, that spies were among them. But those fears soon melted into something far stranger, routine. Each morning, trucks from the camps rolled into towns, carrying German prisoners to nearby farms, lumber yards, or factories. They worked under guard, yes, but side by side with American laborers. And something remarkable began to happen. Conversations. A few words at first, then laughter, then friendship. For many Americans, it was the first time they'd ever met a German who wasn't wearing a swastika or shouting propaganda. For the prisoners, it was the first time they'd been treated not as monsters, but as men. The U.S. military strictly forbade fraternization. But humanity doesn't obey orders. Farmers invited prisoners to dinner. Children brought them lemonade on hot days. Some POWs even joined local church choirs. One American woman later recalled, "They sang Christmas songs in German. We didn't understand the words, but we knew the feeling." At the camps, Red Cross inspectors ensured humane treatment. good food, medical care, and fair wages, paid in camp currency. For many prisoners, this was the first time in years they'd eaten full meals. They wrote home to their families in Germany, describing what they saw as a paradise behind wire. Of course, not every camp was peaceful. There were fights, escapes, and ideological clashes, particularly between die-hard Nazis and those who wanted nothing more than to go home. But overall, discipline held. The U.S. realized that by treating prisoners well, they encouraged Allied POWs in Germany to be treated the same. What began as a wartime necessity slowly became a moral experiment, one that revealed more about the American spirit than any propaganda ever could. When the war ended, these camps vanished almost overnight. Barbed wire was torn down, barracks became storage sheds or hay barns. Only faint traces, concrete foundations, buried ration tins, old carvings, remain in the soil. And yet, in towns across the country, memories linger. Stories passed down of the polite Germans, the men who sang while they worked, who carved wooden toys, who sent thank you letters long after they'd been repatriated. They were supposed to be enemies. Instead, they left behind something else entirely, a quiet testament to decency in a time of hate. In almost every POW camp across America, there were stories whispered at night, stories of friendship, trust, and sometimes forbidden love. The rules were clear: no fraternization, no contact beyond work, no relationships with civilians. But life has a way of ignoring rules, especially when hearts are involved. It started innocently enough: a smile, a shared cigarette, a kind word over a fence. Many American women worked on farms or in canteens near the camps. Some were young wives with husbands away at war. Others were daughters helping their families survive while labor was scarce. They'd see these German prisoners arrive each morning, polite, quiet, hard-working, grateful for any small kindness, and slowly, curiosity turned to conversation. Conversation turned to connection. One woman in Arkansas remembered years later, "He spoke barely any English. I spoke no German, but he'd whistle when he saw me, and somehow I understood everything." The military tried to keep the camps isolated, but in rural areas it was impossible. Farmers needed help. Towns needed workers. And so, every day, fences blurred. In Texas, a local girl left small notes hidden in the bread she baked for the POWs. In Michigan, a prisoner carved a wooden brooch in the shape of a heart and slipped it through the fence for the woman who brought water to the workers. In Georgia, a family let a POW join their Sunday dinner. Just one meal, they promised the guards. But that one meal turned into months of shared laughter and silent understanding. Of course, discovery meant punishment. Guards separated troublemakers. Civilians risked fines or worse. But affection doesn't vanish under threat. It only grows quieter, more determined. When the war ended and repatriation began, hundreds of those POWs were sent back to Germany. Yet many wrote letters to the families they'd met, some even to the women they'd loved. The U.S. military censored mail, but somehow a few letters made it through. Years later, when peace returned, some of those men came back, not as prisoners, but as immigrants. A handful found the women they'd written to. A few even married them. One such man, Hans from Bavaria, returned to Louisiana in 1948 with just a suitcase and a photograph of the girl who had once brought him water every day at the fence. When he stepped off the train, she was waiting. They married that spring and ran a small bakery together for 40 years. Their son once said, "My father fought for Hitler. My mother's brother died in the war, and yet they built something beautiful from all that loss." These stories were never written in history books, but they existed. Proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, love found a way to slip through the cracks in the wire. For the German POWs, freedom didn't come with the sound of cheering or parades. It came with a quiet knock on the barracks door and an order: "Pack your things, you're going home." But home, the word that once meant warmth, family, and familiarity, had changed. The trains that had brought them across America now carried them in reverse, back to the ports. The long, sunlit fields of Texas and Iowa gave way to the dark Atlantic once more. For months, the ships crossed eastward, carrying men who had changed more than they realized. As the POWs looked back from the decks, many were torn between relief and grief. America, the enemy nation that had captured them, had also given them something unexpected: respect, dignity, even friendship. They were leaving a place that had treated them as men, to return to one that barely resembled the home they remembered. When the ships reached Europe, the truth hit them like a physical blow. Germany was unrecognizable. Cities once filled with laughter were now hollow shells. Streets they'd grown up on were flattened into dust. Families were scattered, some dead, some displaced, some surviving in refugee camps. The Reich that had promised them glory had left behind only hunger and ruin. Many returned to find their homes gone, their parents buried, their siblings missing, and worse, they were branded with shame, not as returning heroes, but as reminders of a lost war. Some villagers refused to look them in the eye. Others muttered words like traitor or coward. But the former POWs carried something that made them different from the rest: perspective. They had seen the world outside Germany. They had worked beside Americans, spoken to them, eaten with them, and realized that their enemies were not monsters. They had seen democracy not as propaganda, but as life in motion, flawed, loud, chaotic, but human, and they began to rebuild differently. Men who had labored on American farms used what they'd learned to plant again in German soil. Others started carpentry workshops, teaching American-style efficiency to their apprentices. Some, inspired by how they'd been treated, joined movements for reconciliation and peace. A few wrote memoirs that quietly circulated through post-war Germany. One former POW wrote, "They taught us how to be men again. Not soldiers, not servants of an idea, just men who could think and feel." The irony was cruel and profound. Hitler's soldiers had gone to war believing they were destined to reshape the world. Instead, many found themselves reshaped, not by ideology, but by kindness from those they were told to hate. And yet, for every man who returned changed, thousands more struggled to adapt. Some could never reconcile what they'd seen. Some longed to return to the quiet fields of Kansas, the farms of Georgia, the forests of Oregon, anywhere but the broken streets of home. They had left America as prisoners, but in their hearts, many left it as something closer to refugees of the soul. The war had ended, but for many German POWs, the story didn't. Thousands carried America with them, not as a land of victory or defeat, but as a place that had quietly altered the course of their lives. They wrote letters. In the winter of 1946, American post offices began receiving envelopes marked with strange addresses: villages in Bavaria, towns along the Rhine, hamlets in Saxony. Inside were words written in careful, halting English. "I hope you remember me. I worked on your farm in 1944. How is your family?" Some Americans wrote back. Farmers sent photos of newborn babies, Christmas cards, or even packages with chocolate and coffee. Small luxuries Germany hadn't seen in years. Children who had once been scared of the enemy soldiers now drew pictures for their German pen pals. And across an ocean, a quiet exchange began. Friendship born in captivity, sustained by paper and faith. One farmer in Nebraska received a letter from a former POW named Otto. It read, "You treated me like a man, not a Nazi. Because of that, I try to live my life the same way you showed me, working hard and being fair. I thank you for that lesson every day." Stories like that multiplied. By the 1950s, hundreds of American families were still corresponding with former prisoners. A few even invited them back once they could afford to travel. In 1954, a Kansas newspaper ran a story titled, "Our German Friend Returns." The article described a former POW visiting the family farm where he had once picked corn under guard. Now he came as a guest, hugging the farmer's children and standing beside the same barn he'd helped repair. "We were both just boys then," the farmer said, tears in his eyes. For some men, the letters became a lifeline through Germany's long post-war struggle. They found hope in the kindness of people who should have hated them. Some learned English fluently through their correspondence. Others named their children after their American friends. One man, writing from Bremen, ended his letter with words that seemed to speak for an entire generation. "I do not know what to call myself. I am German, yes, but a part of me stayed with you. When I hear an airplane, I remember your fields. When I smell wheat, I remember your land. You gave me back my humanity when my country had lost its own." In those letters, faded, yellowed but preserved in drawers and attics, there is a story bigger than war or politics. It's the story of how compassion disarmed men more powerfully than bullets ever could. And even decades later, long after the last camps were torn down, that invisible bridge of words still spanned the Atlantic, between the men who came as enemies and the people who showed them they didn't have to stay that way. By 1946, most German POWs had been sent home. But for thousands, the journey back stretched far longer than expected. Ships were slow, paperwork tangled, and Europe was still a wreck of smoking ruins. Some men didn't leave America until 1947, 2 full years after the war had ended. They were the last ghosts of a global war, lingering quietly in a country that had already moved on. For many Americans, the prisoners' presence had become normal. Familiar faces at the sawmill, in the orchards, on the railroad lines. When the trucks finally came to take them away, townspeople lined the roads to watch them go. There were waves, handshakes, sometimes tears, and always one final promise whispered through the fences: "We'll write." Some of them did more than write. A few returned years later, not as soldiers, but as immigrants. The United States passed laws allowing certain former POWs to apply for visas if they had good conduct records, and many did. They arrived quietly with work experience and perfect English, and settled into the same small towns where they had once been prisoners. One man from Hesse found his way back to Alabama, bought land from the farmer he'd once worked for, and started his own cotton farm. Another, who had fallen in love with an American nurse, returned in 1952 and married her, raising a family that would never know barbed wire except in stories. For those who couldn't return, America lived on in their memories, not as a dream, but as a lesson. They kept their promise in the way they lived. Many became teachers, engineers, or community leaders in post-war Germany, shaping a nation that vowed never again to lose its moral compass. A group of former POWs in Munich formed a club they called Die Brücke, the bridge. They met every year on the anniversary of their release to celebrate not victory, not survival, but friendship. They wrote letters to their American hosts, collected donations for post-war children's hospitals, and taught young Germans about the value of compassion. In 1975, a delegation from that club visited the U.S. They traveled from camp to camp, or rather, where the camps had once stood. Some were now cornfields, others parking lots. But at every stop, they laid flowers, not for fallen comrades, but for the memories of kindness that had helped them rise again. Before they left, one of the men, a gray-haired farmer named Franz, said to a reporter, "We came here as enemies. You sent us home as human beings. That's the victory no one writes in history books." When the last of those POWs passed away in the late 20th century, their stories began to fade, but not completely. In the towns they once worked, their names still echo. In family albums, their faces still appear beside American friends, smiling beneath the same wide sky. Their legacy isn't carved in stone or marked by medals. It lives in something quieter, the proof that even in war, humanity can survive captivity. Because the greatest victory of 1945 wasn't just the end of the fighting. It was the beginning of understanding. When history tells the story of World War II, it usually speaks in grand scales, of armies and nations, invasions, and surrender. But sometimes history hides its greatest lessons in quiet places: a field in Texas, a mess hall in Nebraska, a letter written from a camp in Iowa. The story of the German POWs who wanted to stay in America is one of those lessons, not about war, but about what happens when war ends. When the first prisoners arrived, many Americans saw only uniforms. The enemy who had bombed London, burned villages, filled concentration camps. But soon they saw something else: tired boys who missed their homes, men who still wrote letters to mothers they'd never see again. And the prisoners in turn saw that America wasn't what Nazi propaganda had promised. They had been told the U.S. was a place of greed and chaos, ruled by corruption and violence. What they found instead were families who shared food, farmers who paid them fairly, and guards who treated them like men instead of monsters. It was an invisible battle, not of bullets, but of beliefs. And quietly, America won that one too. When the war ended, the Allies sent the men home, expecting them to carry lessons of democracy back to Germany. But what no one realized was how deeply the kindness had taken root. In the rubble of post-war Europe, it became something powerful, a seed of reconciliation. Many former POWs helped rebuild their towns using the values they'd seen in the camps: cooperation, fairness, honesty. Some became translators for the U.S. military. Others worked in the new German government that would rise from the ashes of the Third Reich. And almost all of them told their children, "Never hate so easily again." Historians now say those camps, the American ones, were some of the quietest and most effective tools of re-education in the entire war. Without classrooms or slogans, they had shown tens of thousands of men a different way to live. Decades later, when those same men grew old, they would tell their grandchildren stories that began not with battles, but with names. The American guard who taught them English, the farmer's wife who baked them pie, the local boy who gave them a Christmas card through the fence. Those small acts did what no treaty ever could. They ended the war inside people's hearts. Because for the German POWs who wanted to stay, America was not just a place. It was proof. Proof that enemies could become friends, that kindness could erase propaganda, that forgiveness could rewrite the end of even the darkest chapters in human history. And when they went home, willingly or not, they carried that truth across an ocean. The world remembered the bombs, the battles, the destruction, but these men remembered something greater: a handshake through a fence, a meal shared without fear, a glimpse of a world worth rebuilding. That was their legacy. And in the quiet corners of America, where the fences have long since vanished and the fields have grown over, their story still lingers, a reminder that even in war, humanity can win.